Okay, this is a quick demonstration of animating in Figma and getting used to motion curves. So I have a blank design document open here in Figma, and I'm going to give myself a frame. Let's go ahead and make this the same as what we made it for our first bouncing ball exercise. So I'm going to make this 1080 by 1080. Now that I have my frame here, instead of hand drawing every single frame in this animation, what we're going to use is interpolation. And what interpolation is basically pose-to-pose animation that is automating the steps in between. So we are going to set kind of the extremes of the motion, and then we're going to ask the computer to fill in the frames in between. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and draw my scene. So I'm going to use our shape tools to give myself a floor here so we can see something to collide with. And then I'm going to use the ellipse tool there we go, to draw our ball. And I'm just going to change the color of that to make it a little easier to see. Okay, so this is essentially the first part of our animation. We're going to start with the ball at the top, and we want it to fall down to the bottom, picking up speed, and then bounce back to the top. So the other extreme of this is going to be the ball at the bottom of the screen. So I'm going to hold Option and hover over my frame name and then duplicate this entire frame so that I have a copy of it. And then I'm going to move my ball down to the ground. Now, animating in Figma certainly has plenty of limitations, so we are not going to be able to implement squash and stretch here, but this is just to get the hang of motion curves. So we're just concerned with the movement on the y-axis for our case here. Okay, the next thing we need to do to start animating here is to get this prototype set up to get these frames connected. So I'm going to switch over into my prototype tab. I'm going to hover over frame 1, and then I'm going to click and drag to connect frame 1 to frame 2. And then I'm going to connect frame 2 back to frame 1. Let's reset this stuff here. It gave us some defaults. So just to show that again, I'm in prototype, connect frame 1 to 2, and then come over here and connect frame 2 back to frame 1. Okay, so I wanted to clear those presets because I wanted to go through step by step what these connection options should be set up as. So we're kind of hacking Figma a little bit here to work for animation. Obviously it's not an animation tool. So to get that effect, we're basically going to constantly be navigating between two frames. So I'm going to switch our transition to after delay. The minimum we can have is 1 millisecond. We want to navigate to frame 2, that's correct. We do want to smart animate. And then I'm going to switch linear to custom Bezier. And this is going to be our motion curve that we're going to be working with. I'm going to do the same thing on frame 2, moving back to frame 1. So set this to after delay, 1 millisecond, navigate, smart animate, and then custom Bezier. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to start on the first frame here, and this chart here is essentially our motion curve, and the reason we're working in here instead of in After Effects is because it's much simpler to kind of get up and get going here than it would be to go through kind of keyframes and everything else in After Effects just for the sake of learning motion curves. So you'll see I have these 2 points. This is essentially a graph, and on our x-axis is time, That's the 600 milliseconds that we have set up. And our y-axis is the position, so the change in position from frame 1 to frame 2. As we click into here, so if I click on that first point there, I get a handle, and this lets me edit our Bezier curve. And the same thing happens if I click on the second point. So I can draw this curve any way I want to. The handles influence how much of an influence that this point has on the curve. So the longer this gets, the more influence this right portion has. And the same on the left, the longer this gets, you'll see my curve starts to move over to this point with the most influence. So by default, this is going to be a linear motion, and it's not going to look super great. So let me pull up a preview here by going to my play, and instead of present, I'm going to use preview, just so we can have this open while we're working. Shrink this down a little. So this linear motion is very unnatural. We're moving at a constant speed and a constant rate of change. Instead, what we need to think about is easing. So if we think back to our frame-by-frame animation, as the ball is falling, it's picking up speed. So it's moving faster and faster as it falls, which means that it starts slower and it gets faster. So that is what we call ease in. So the rate of change will be slow at first and then speed up quickly at the end of this motion. And what that looks like is something like this. So if I take this first handle and I'm going to drag it over to the right, so changes slowly at first, and then at the end suddenly we're changing very quickly over the last few frames of this animation. So you'll see the falling here starts to look a lot more natural. I'm going to drag this back just a little bit. But our movement back up still looks really strange. So let me switch over to that and take a look here. So when we move back up, we have the opposite interaction taking place. So we are starting very quickly because we have all of that momentum from coming down, and then as gravity takes hold of the ball, it slows down at the peak of the bounce. So that looks almost exactly opposite of our first motion curve. So instead of dragging over to the right, I'm going to drag up towards the top. So we're changing from our first position very quickly over time, and then we slow down as we get to the top. That still looks not quite right. So I'm going to increase that even further. And then I think one of the things that would help us here is actually decreasing that animation time for us, so shortening this a little bit, because the end of this is looking like it's taking just a bit too long. So yeah, adding in that handle doesn't help very much. So let's try cutting this down to 300 milliseconds and see where that gets us. Okay, so once we get going a little faster, this starts to look a lot more natural. And the key here is these two easing animations from starting slow and moving faster as we get going, and then in the opposite direction, starting quickly and slowing down as we move through.